And welcome to episode 167 of the Power Score LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
John, the April 2025 LSAT has just occurred, and we're here to recap what we know about that exam. Are you feeling excited?
Yes, we are. What is left of me after this test week is feeling very excited, Dave. Yeah.
You put in a serious shift of hours over the last couple days of the week as well as the weekend.
Yeah, an unfortunate and unexpected amount of work that this test happened to require of me and of you, and frankly of really everyone. I saw students devoting an awful lot of post-test time to this one too. So credit due all around. This one really took a toll on everybody.
Well, if it took a toll out of you, I imagine you're having a drink today. So tell me what you're drinking.
Buddy, you would actually imagine wrong. As much as I deserve a drink, I feel I've got a good lady friend coming in town, a girl you know actually, coming in town tomorrow morning. And because you know her, I think you won't be surprised to hear that she is coming in hot. She's bringing bubbles for breakfast bright and early tomorrow. On the day this releases, I'm sure I will have a drink. So I'm pacing myself. I'm actually not drinking tonight because I know I'm going to be awoken to the sound of a champagne cork, I think.
Nice. Well, I was in fact there when the two of you met because you and I went to that wine tasting.
We did, yeah. She's up in your neck of the woods, runs a couple vineyards up there. So, yeah.
8 miles from me.
Yep. She's always a fun visit. She's a good hang.
Yeah, I like her.
She'll be here for 4 or 5 days, rest of this week into the weekend. Looking forward to it. So I will be drinking. I'm just not quite there yet. How about you?
Yeah,
You're making up for me.
Clearly, always. But I'll tell you this, I did not take your cue of like, oh, I'm not going to drink. But I'm having an amaretto sour, which is kind of like the easiest way to drink because I love amaretto, and an amaretto sour is, those go down pretty quickly. I don't know why. I used to drink those a lot years and years ago, and then I stopped drinking them for like 15 years or so, and now I'm back to it.
Back, baby. Back in the saddle.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I'm feeling good about it.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Have some for me, please. And then I'll try to play catch up tomorrow, which shouldn't be too tough.
Yeah, you'll catch up fast, probably by 11 a.m.
Sounds about right. You picked the song today, and I feel, knowing the title of it at least, I can't say I know the song or really the band. I feel you should explain it, although I think I know why you picked it. Elaborate.
I did, because you and I were debating songs, not only that have been popular recently, but we were really trying to find something that captured the nature of really any topic that we talk about in this podcast, but specifically this one about the April test.
Yeah.
And I realized that there is a song by Falling in Reverse called Watch the World Burn. And that is exactly how I feel about what LSAC has, engaged in over the past several days. Is they finally pulled a trick out of their bag that I think, John, you and I felt that they would pull out, probably years ago. I think the biggest surprise that we've had is that we didn't see this previously, and now we finally encountered it. And so I feel like this was their moment where they're like, we're just going to light it all on fire.
Yeah, it felt like a real gotcha moment that they'd been waiting to spring. I can't believe it took this long, frankly. People are, I'm sure, scratching their heads if they don't know yet what we're talking to. We'll get to it. We'll keep you in suspense for a bit, but it's coming. This will make sense soon enough. But yeah, they kind of pulled a fast one on us here, sort of to our surprise, although like you say, it's not all that surprising that they eventually did what they did.
I mean, if I'd been running LSAC for the last several years, this would have been the very first thing that I did to test takers to cause confusion. The fact that it took this long, again, will always keep me in astonishment. But regardless, let's get into it. Let's talk about the LSAT world. John, what do you have for us there?
Let's do it. I think we'll actually get through this a little quicker than normal. We don't need to get into stats and too much test info. You can Google that stuff if you're interested. There are 2 tests, though, to discuss. April having just happened, we'll talk about the score release. Obviously, the test itself is done. There will be a makeup test. There always is. If anything went wrong with your test administration from Thursday through this past Saturday, there is a chance for you to take the test next week. I believe it's next Tuesday, so a week from when we're recording this, typically what they do. And then that test, as well as all the ones that were just successfully completed over the past several days, will release on Wednesday morning, April 30th. And that'll be at 9 a.m. Eastern is when those scores will populate in your student center, and you'll get an email around that time as well. Following that is the June test. That deadline is actually a week of this recording next Tuesday, April 22nd, midnight that night, Eastern, is when the cutoff for that registration is for that test. So if you're not registered for June, you've got a little time left. Go ahead and get signed up. Those test dates are Wednesday through Saturday, early in June 4th through the 7th. That score release is near the end of June on June 25th. And the final thing I'll say about these test dates is this. April scores come out after the registration deadline for the June test. But LSAC has done a fairly generous thing here, which is they are allowing people who sign up for the June test to get their money back until May 1st. So you actually have an extra day after these April scores release to request your June registration money back if you don't want to take June with an April score in hand. You still have to sign up for June blind, but you will get an April score if you just took April before your deadline essentially cuts off to get your June money back, which is good. You only have a day, but you can at least know what you got in April if you tested, and then back out of June if you need to. So go ahead and get signed up for June if you're uncertain. You can actually do it consequence-free.
I mean, you can term it generous, but wouldn't the smarter thing just have been to make the June deadline May 1st, man?
Yeah.
Why am I feel like a broken record. I'm really tired of okay, we could have done this differently, right? Sometimes these companies that are so large get so used to these systems and this is the way it has to be that they stop and completely forget about what's reasonable. We live in a digital age. We don't have to have a deadline this far in advance. This deadline is still the same as it was years ago.
Yeah.
As if, the internet never happened. So, I'm not impressed by that. I'm like, just push the deadline back. They won't make any difference.
Clearly
man.
don't
9
need
days.
6 weeks of gap between when they're forcing people to register versus when people will start testing. That's crazy. And if they can still give you your money back 9 days later or whatever it is, again, they could have just moved the whole thing. It's silly.
It's more confusing and more difficult to have this stupid system where it's like, well, if you've registered, but then, you change your mind, you have 9 days. Give me a break. Just push the deadline back so I can wait till the very last minute to do it.
It was confusing to me just having to explain it. I can't imagine what people on the other end have to feel about.
No, they're irritated by it. This is just, fumbling as we kind of go to the LSAT paradise.
There we are.
If you are taking that June LSAT, though, there are a couple seminars that are coming up here. One is actually the day this podcast comes out, which is the 16th of April.
Yeah.
We're doing one on logical reasoning, parallel reasoning. So that'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern. There's another one on April 29th. That is the LSAT 101, kind of the basic introduction that we do to the test. And then on May 13th, there is a webinar that is on reading comprehension, and it is our very well-known RC skills test webinar. So if you want to get better and learn how to get better and learn how to test various things about how you read and how you answer questions, that is a killer webinar for that. The interesting thing, though, John, is that there is one webinar that you and I often do for an LSAT that I didn't mention, and that is the mini ball, which is the update on the full-fledged April-June crystal ball that we did some time ago. Are we going to do an update specifically for June? That is the question.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to this was always pretty conclusively yes, but now I can drop the pretty from that. It is conclusively yes, we are going to do one. We had thought we were, but now that the April test is concluded, we've seen what happened. We can happily confirm, as we had hoped, that we did get things in our April-June crystal ball that we did back in March. We did get things right. Our predictions came true, as we'd hoped. Now we can turn around and update that one for the June test specifically, and that'll be the mini ball that we're going to do. When are we going to do it? That will be on Tuesday, May the 6th. Likely, I think we'll probably do it at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 our time.
Indeed, it will be 8 p.m. And then by the time this podcast comes out, the registration link should be on the powerscore.com site. Just go to resources, webinars.
Yeah, it's down at the bottom.
It'll be right off a menu option at the top. You should be able to go ahead and register then and there. All right, John, that'll be another mini ball coming up.
Yep. So I suppose I think I'm going to relax the rest of this week, but as soon as she leaves town and Monday rolls around, I'll get right into making that one, doing the updates for us. Before we do that, though, let's talk about what just happened with this April test and some of the things from the crystal ball that we can begin to cross off the list when we do the mini ball itself. Let's talk April.
Yeah, we know this was a multi-day test, as they all are. these days. Let's start off with issues. Any kind of like proctor issues, systemic issues that you saw?
Yeah, well, this will be quick because I didn't really see any. I mean, granted, there were some scattered, isolated incidents, largely from remote testing, people who were taking it at home or in an office or something, versus in person, where you go to a test center that LSAC sets up and provides. That tends to be the case these days. It's not that test centers are perfect, but they do tend to be staffed by people who know what's going on. Internet connections tend to be more reliable. The machines, the hardware, the software, those tend to be better, or at least more consistently dependable. It's usually people who are doing the one-off things at home that run into the issues. And that was the case this time around as well. When things did go wrong, it tended to happen to those people. But I didn't see anything systemic. I didn't see anything that was like, major widespread outages, which is really the thing that we keep an eye out for. This whole thing didn't crash or go down, which was good.
Yeah, it's largely individuals being affected, not large groups being affected.
Yeah.
So it's terrible when anything like this happens at all. But at least there is the widespread benefit of it not affecting hundreds or thousands of people, because we have seen those types of issues in the past. It's been a while though, so
yeah,
one could make the argument that they're settling into a decent relationship with Prometric. It still can be improved. There's a lot of places it could be improved, quite honestly, but we haven't seen system breakdowns recently, and that's always a good thing.
And this tends to be a pretty placid time of year weather-wise too, which always helps. We don't have hurricanes typically in April. Winter storms are for the most part behind us. So we shall see.
All right. Well, then it's time for us to talk about those exams that we saw over the past several days. And before we jump into that, I'm just going to really kind of burn through a couple of quick disclaimers. We're trying to shorten the time it takes to get to the test discussion here. Yeah. But the first thing I'm going to say, it's always the same thing. We ask that you not summarize what we say in this podcast online. The podcast is free. Summaries miss the nuance. All the time, even though I think this is fairly straightforward, they still miss a lot of nuance, and we'd really prefer people to hear it straight from us. So if you can, don't post it online, just post the link to the podcast if needed. There's all sorts of things that I usually talk about in terms of like reminders about section order being different for various students, about disclosure and the fact that, once the test is over, LSAC largely allows test conversations. That's where some of this information comes from, but not all of this information. We do use some information that we have from past tests that we have collected. I also often talk about how people feel about the LSAT and how a real LSAT, doesn't feel as good as, say, a practice LSAT. If you want to hear all of that, go back to the last test recap and kind of listen through that entire thing. Really, the most important thing that I want to mention is we're going to talk about the content as we heard it being disclosed, both sometimes publicly, a lot of times in students talking to us, in other ways that we gather information. It is possible that you will not hear your section discussed. That can happen for different reasons. One is you might have forgotten. After a couple of days, this becomes a total blur, and you may not actually remember some of the things that we're talking about, even if you had that section. So recall is a really big question. Also, sometimes we might not talk about questions that you specifically remember, but you still had. We might be talking about the same section. And it is possible that we just didn't realize a particular section was administered. We do our best to collect all the information, but unless we hear from students who had certain content, we will not know for sure whether some content was used. So just keep that in mind as you kind of go through this. You should hear content that you had, and if you didn't, ask yourself, is it because I've forgotten, or I don't remember, or I just don't remember that specific question, or is it possible that you had an entirely different test format that you really didn't disclose to anyone? At this point, let us know if that's the case, because we would love to hear that. John, with that, let's go to the International LSAT.
Let's do it. Except I'm going to want to add one small additional kind of disclaimer to that last thing you mentioned, which is this. I saw a lot of debate online, and this is, I think, totally due to the fact that people's memories get a little fuzzy very quickly about this test. You add a couple of days to that, and it just becomes a complete blur, as you just said. There was a lot of debate online about whether or not people were getting mixed and matched content. I had those two passages, but not those two in my section, or I had those logical reasoning questions in my first, but these logical reasoning questions in my third. the question then became, is LSAC actually taking some real questions, some experimental questions, and swapping them in kind of piecemeal? Are sections half and half or 3/4? And the answer that I continued to give people, and will say again now, just to put this mystery to bed, is it's all or nothing. Sections are always the same for everyone. You're not going to have a section that has partial overlap with someone else. You sometimes will get topic overlap with someone else, but it is not the same content. LSAC is notorious, as we're about to see, for using content, or again, using topics in a broad sense that feel similar or that might touch on the same subject matter but aren't identical, aren't the same. This is why details matter. This is partly why we ask you not to summarize this online, is because it does miss that specificity that's crucial. So again, if you thought, well, I only had piece of that section, or I only had 2 of those 4 passages, no, you didn't. You had all of it. You're just misremembering. And again, the confusion that occurs online is due to that, not the fact that LSAC did something wholly unique or novel for this particular test.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to make. And part of the reason that oftentimes we're able to, disconfirm that particular rumor is with a lot of the test reuse, we actually know what the content was in certain sections to a almost perfect degree.
Yeah.
So we can go back and look at it and be like, no, this person's getting confused. People get confused online and recall even 20 minutes after the test far more than you would actually expect. I will say this though, Jon, if I was running LSAC, that too would be one of the very first things that I would do. Is I would indeed start mixing and matching stuff, and then I would also commingle experimental with real material and end the ability for anyone to have any conversation. But I don't run them, so I don't have to worry about that.
Well, it would change the nature of test disclosures, test releases, test scaling. It would throw a real wrench in the historical way that they have done things. I'm not sure that they particularly care.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure what they care about, to be quite frank. But
no, there's a lot of ways to make this far worse than the situation actually is. I certainly am the first person to complain about the way that it is now, but it could be worse.
Yes.
But it also could be better. So I won't stop complaining about it.
No,
Either way, let's get into the international version of the April LSAT, because this was a really bifurcated test to some extent, as we'll see. There was an international set of test takers, and then there was a domestic set of test takers. Often they don't get the same content.
Yeah.
So let's get into that.
Yeah, typically, in fact, there is an almost perfect division. Internationally, people overseas tend to get their own unique set of stuff with no overlap at all between what people domestically see. I believe that was the case back in January, which was the last time we had an international set of people. February, there wasn't one. But in January, I don't think there was any degree of overlap between the two. This time, we actually saw a bit. So as we go through this international section here in this discussion, what we're going to focus on is just the content that was used internationally and not here in North America. When we get into the domestic discussion, which will come next, some of that will apply to international test takers as well. So if you are an international person listening to this and we go through it and you're like, I didn't get any of that, just sit tight. It's very likely that your content is coming when we get to the domestic discussion to follow. For now, though, this is what we saw exclusively overseas. And I'll start, as we always do, and we'll do this domestically here in a bit as well, with self-assessment, let's call it. We'll grade ourselves with the crystal ball, except when it comes to international tests, this doesn't really apply. We always put the disclaimer on the crystal ball that we're doing this for domestic test reuses only. And the reason why is with international tests, kind of like the makeup test that we'll see next week, LSAC doesn't really follow any particular rules or patterns of predictable reuses. That's to say, with international exams, anything's really fair game or up for grabs. They'll use a test for the 4th, the 5th, the 8th time, and have really no compunction or qualms about doing so. We saw that with some of these international tests. The first section of reading comp that I'm going to mention here, this is at least the 4th, possibly 5th time that we've seen these passages get used. So that's not the sort of thing that is predictable, therefore not the sort of thing we would even attempt in a crystal ball to predict. So
multiple reasons not to predict this. It's international. It's multiple reuse of this content.
Yeah.
Wasn't what we tried to get.
Yeah, this wasn't even something we had on our radar as an attempt. It's not that we're avoiding the international for the fact that they are international. It's really just behavior of LSAC. So no knock on the people taking it overseas, just the way that LSAC treats you. Sorry about that.
It's more variable.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let's talk then about the reading comprehension. There were 2 scored sections of reading comprehension that I saw. Interestingly enough, all of the experimental reading comprehension that I saw for people internationally was the same that was used domestically. So we're going to hold off on that discussion for a bit. But these were the 2 scored sections of reading comprehension that were exclusively overseas. And the first section of real reading comprehension, 27 questions, is a very well-known section to us, at least, because it came from these past usages. The first appearance was in February of 2021. We saw it used again the next year, November of 2022. They gave it a bit of a break. It came up in September of last year, September 2024. And then here it comes again internationally this April. And it contained these 4 passages, I believe in this order. The first one was about Frances Harper and women's suffrages, the African-American women's suffrage movement. The second passage was about ancient astronomy. It was very accurate, and it apparently then formed some basis for astrology. Be an interesting one to read. The comparative passage came third, and it was about the nature of aesthetic knowledge and judgments and testimony. And then finally, I believe that was the legal passage. Finally, another one that had some law in it, the alternatives to modern copyrights. It was arguing essentially to go into a shorter duration, distinction between different mediums. They could talk about literature and music as having kind of copyright length distinctions to them. If you had that reading comprehension section overseas, that was a real section. I think from what I saw, everyone who had that set, though, had 3 logical reasoning sections with it. So I don't think there was much mystery about that. So there you go.
Yeah. As always, I'm really interested in the copyrights one. In fact, Jack Dorsey, the guy who was the Twitter founder, sent out this weekend that all IP should be, the law should be removed or deleted, I think was the word. So we shouldn't have intellectual property law anymore. And my first reaction was, that's not really a great idea.
Yeah, you want to kill innovation real fast?
Well, if you're an AI company and you just want to suck up every piece of information out there, it's great for you. Elon Musk immediately retweeted, said agree. And I'm like, well, of course you guys all agree with it. You can make money off the fact that there's no IP law. IP law is what's actually protecting creators from people like you now.
Yeah. Yeah. What does the burglar want? Of course there shouldn't be alarm systems.
There should be no laws against thievery.
Right. How dare you put up a fence?
Delete thievery laws.
Thanks, Jack. Real deep take there, buddy. Anyway, that was the passage there that I would like to see is about ancient astronomy and astrology. I think I'd get a good giggle out of that. But those passages were real. Again, we only saw those overseas. I don't think anybody in the States or in Canada got those. But there you go. We'll talk about the scaling for that section in just a bit. The other section of real reading comprehension that I only saw internationally were these 4 passages, another set that's very well known to us. First appeared back in November of 2020, and then we saw it again in September of 22. We saw it internationally in October of 2023. It were these 4. One of the passages was about the removal or displacement of Indian tribes, indigenous people, and populations from Canadian national parks. The comparative passage in this was a science passage about academic science journals online, the effect that social media was having on them. I think it was specifically about the nature of people's trust in vaccines. So kind of a topical passage. Interestingly, that posted that in late November of 2020. It's the first appearance of that, if you think about the debate of vaccines at the time. A passage I think Dave and I would both like to see was about Francisco Goya and his black paintings. Quite famously. Goya. Yeah, quite famously if you're into Spanish art. And then a passage, the legal passage here, was about the nature of punishment in law, the phrase just deserts, and the nature of utilitarian purpose of punishment. Again, I only saw this as a single set of reading comp paired with 3 logical reasonings. It's part of the reason we knew that these were real, and we've also seen these many, many times before. As soon as I saw Goya getting talked about, I was like, I know what those are. So there you go.
Yeah. Although you always have to be careful because there could be some Goya expert who wrote a passage who then is writing more passages down the line.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I would almost become, again, a bit of a hypocrite, wouldn't I? If I was like, Goya's enough.
Yeah, a harbinger of future conversations here in a few minutes.
Yeah. There's some foreboding in that, clearly. Like I said, I didn't see any experimental reading comp that was unique to the international test takers. I did see some, but it was also used domestically, so I'm going to table that for the time being. What I did see internationally, and frankly I saw too much of it for my taste, was an awful lot of logical reasoning getting kicked around, mostly because the vast majority of international people that I saw had 3 logical reasoning sections, which means a lot of experimental logical reasoning was being used as well. And there were a lot of scored logical reasoning getting mixed and interchanged. All of it reuses of past test content that we've seen. I didn't see any international test content that was new, which is good and bad. It's good because we can easily identify it. We've seen it before. We have a really good handle on it. It's bad because if they're going to reuse things, it opens up a vault, basically, for the test makers to pull from. And they really dug around in there. They had no qualms about using a lot of different things. Here were the 4 sections that I can confirm were used and that should have all been scored. If you somehow saw 3 of these 4, please let me know. It would be the first that I'm hearing from anyone where that was the case, but I would still like to hear from you. I am going to say that I think each of these was a scored section. I only heard from people who had 2 of these in various combinations. So I feel pretty good about this, but like I said, if I didn't hear from you, I can only help so much. Anything to interject before I launch in, Dave?
No, I think that's almost the disclaimer we always make.
Yeah.
We think we have it all. However, we are also aware that there can be outliers, unusual instances where someone didn't get some of this or who knows what.
Yeah.
So
I will say, for instance, one of these I didn't get until late Sunday night. I thought I was done. Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. So it could be the case that there's still something floating around that I've missed or haven't heard about. I don't think I missed anything, but there is a likelihood, at least a small likelihood, that someone just didn't say something. So here we go. From what I know, these were the 4 real sections of logical reasoning overseas. The first, from the same source as that first set of reading comprehension that I mentioned with Francis Harper and the copyrights and stuff, November 22. There was a survey about telemarketing being effective, aesthetic judgment, a topic that we saw in some reading comp as well. Rain during a bicycle race, cycling on wet roads, upper and lower tenants, paying utilities, question that gets a lot of talking when people see it. There was one about nightlife and night as a frontier, some new frontier, a freeway being built to reduce traffic to a suburb, but traffic still increased. And then the question I saw being talked about the most and how I identified this section and then was able to confirm with some other questions was one about beta carotene and its correlation with better health. The difference in supplements versus, as we will see here, taking it as pills versus, like I say, supplements, vegetables. So there we go. That is one section that we have seen. That beta carotene was the one that pointed me in that direction, and I confirmed with some more.
Yep.
All right. Anything to add to that?
No, I'm just going to let you roll through all of these.
Okay. Let me keep scrolling down. There's a lot of questions here. I'm kind of kicking through as I go. Give me 1 second. Screen just jumped on me. This is what happens when there's this much LR, I suppose.
It's a lot of LR, honestly, for the international test.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back as I kind of run through this. I'm trying to remember if I've seen this much logical reasoning on an international test, 4 sections that seem to be real. I can't think of any. But as always, we do our best. Here is another section of logical reasoning that we saw, also from that November 2022 source. So we feel that these were paired up then, paired up again here. And the question that I saw that again pointed me in this direction was about sour milk and the formation of cheese. If that rings a bell for you, keep an ear out for the rest of these questions, but this was very likely a scored section for you overseas. It was one about male songbirds, colorful songbirds and their nesting habits, how they for some reason don't seem to seek shelter, fossil fuel, power plants, and new technology for energy savings. A question about chimpanzees and baboons, arboreal primates as they were called, forming alliances within their groups. Youth, question I'd like to read, youth becoming more libertarian, which I think is kind of interesting. So again, if a few of those ring a bell, it's always nice to have more than one to confirm. If a few of those ring a bell and you saw them, that should have been a scored section for you, one that we've seen before.
It's funny because that question must be a little bit old about the youth becoming more libertarian, because what has recently been coming out is the youth becoming more conservative.
I think, honestly, give it a couple years and we'll probably see that topic pop up.
Yeah, and then by then it'll have switched again.
Swap back around, yeah. Another section, overseas, international, more real logical reasoning topics that we saw. This one from a different source. First seen in January of 2021. They waited 2 years and it appeared again, January of 2023. They've waited a little over 2 years and here we are again. These had questions on scraping tools, indicating prehistoric people made their own clothing. fashion their own clothes. Faulty airbags in sport and economy cars on this single assembly line, so like a source of a product recall or issue. Health benefits of standing desks versus regular desks. The regulation of drones under current aerial vehicle laws. Guitars as artwork, leading to people somehow feeling melancholy, which is interesting. There's a question in this section about cougars preying on bighorn sheep in a park. There's also some talk of a question on cougars in a domestic logical reasoning section, which we'll get to. And a question that a lot of people were talking about here had to do with people's reaction to the Canadian flag and the maple leaf on it. One person talking about what it meant and another person misunderstanding what they meant by it. So again, if some of those match content that you can recall from your international LR, that was a scored section from what we can tell as well. And I promise we're almost done. There is one last section to discuss from a different source test. This was the one I heard about late Sunday night. It is from November 2020 and reused again September 2022. This was about dinosaurs butting heads, another about monkeys. So they had a lot of monkey questions floating around both overseas and, as we'll get to, international or domestically as well. In this case, it was rhesus monkeys, one teaching another type of monkey how to behave. It was about like angry monkeys calming each other down or teaching each other how to manage their anger. I think it had to do with withholding food. A question about crystals and rubies. It was one about the benefit of low-carb and high-fat diets versus low-fat vegetarian diets, cardio health and weight loss. It's one about starch and potatoes before bed, before sleep. Here's one for you, Dave. Illegal music downloads. So again, back to kind of IP protection, I imagine. And another one for you, Jack Dorsey. Early AI machines, in this case used for medical diagnoses. I think one of the things that it misdiagnosed is diagnosed a car with measles. Just kind of humorous. Clearly a misfire. And then a question about qualifying for employee benefits. So again, if some of those ring a bell, and some of those should, if you had that and don't remember one about early AI machines, that's on you. That should stand out. A car diagnosed with measles should clearly trigger something if you had it. That seems to have been a real section as well.
Look, you can ask the typical AI on X/Twitter these days to identify what movie some kind of clip comes from, and it gets it wrong almost every single time.
What's it called?
So
Grok?
It's not like it's all of a sudden becoming perfect. Love AI, but it has its limitations in this arena. Diagnosing a car with measles, that sounds about right.
Yeah, there you go. So from what we can tell, at least 4 scored sections of logical reasoning in various combinations, 2 scored sections of reading comp, from what I was able to discern, and again, combinations with those different LRs. Let's then get to the matrix and talk about how these combinations work together to produce different scales. And I'll turn this back over to you if you don't mind. Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, you've been talking for a while, but you're doing such a good job with it. I think I'll let you do it next time too. One of the things that Jon said was, we haven't seen them use this much scored LR for an international test. And the reason it's a surprise, because they use this many sections on domestic tests all the time, is remember that the international LSAT is significantly smaller in terms of the number of test takers. Oftentimes maybe 1,000 or 1,500 people. And if you have such a kind of like narrowed test group, you don't really have a need to give them a lot of different content. So to do that is a little bit interesting. That's kind of like the context for his comment there. Mm-hmm. These are the kinds of things that we watch, like what are they doing? Why are they doing it? Either way, let's talk about the scoring of this. And this is actually a relatively easy kind of like administration on the international side to figure out kind of a predicted scale for. But in talking about this, remember, this is how we always do it. We're looking at how many questions you can miss to get a 170. We always start at you can miss 7 questions. That is the baseline. Then we look at the difficulty of each section. Oftentimes we're adding a missed question there, so you might go from 7 to 8 to 9. Occasionally, we're actually tightening the scale if we think the section was relatively easy. So if you did a test and you're like, man, I had a bunch of hard sections, and we come back and we say, yeah, they were hard sections, that loosens your scale. It allows you to miss more questions to get a 170, which conversely means that you have to get fewer correct to get that particular score level. Whenever we're on the line, we're always conservative. So again, there could be exceptions in here, but these were the 2 RC sections and the relative scoring impact. So everybody right now is at -7. The first section that had suffrage, ancient astronomy, the copyright length, and so forth, the one from November 2022. In the past, we have said that this section is difficult and that it moves the scale by 1, and we're going to stick with that. So if you had that section, your scale would go from missing 7 to now missing 8, which we call -8. The same thing happens with the Goya RC. Also, we've seen this a number of times before. We're very comfortable with this. That section was the removal of tribes, the online science journals, the Goya black paintings, and then a punishment in law. That also would move your scaling from 7 to 8. So you take which one you had, no matter what, everybody's at 8 right now from an international standpoint. In LR, all 4 of the sections are going to produce no change. They are all 0. So everybody on the international with this grouping is going to be missing 8 questions to get a 170. So I could read all each of the sections, but it does not matter. Jon just went through all of that. You can listen to his recap because he mentioned multiple questions in each one. Each time I'd be like 0, doesn't move it, 0, doesn't move it. That happens a lot with LR simply because they haven't been using LR to punish people as much as they've been using RC to punish people in recent years. So for international test takers, of all the reported sections that we covered, everyone would have the scaling of -8 to get a 170. You can miss 8 questions.
Beautiful. 2 quick comments before we get to the domestic stuff. One is, again, if you didn't hear a section that you had, there's 2 possibilities. One is we didn't hear from you and we just didn't know about it. The other very realistic possibility, at least at this point in the discussion, is it's coming. Remember, some of the people internationally got content that was also used domestically, and we're just about to talk about that. So just sit tight. It's very possible that we're going to talk about the stuff that you saw overseas in the next few minutes as we get into the domestic content. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you think about how Dave just broke down the scaling of this, and everything essentially comes out to the same outcome of a -8 score or scale at a 170 score, it makes a lot of sense that the test makers would do it that way. If they've got all of this content to pull from, why in the world would they produce a lot of different types of tests, a lot of difficulty variation tests? What you would think they'd want to do is try to produce a fairly uniform set of combinations, regardless of the content itself. You'd want to think they'd keep things fairly standardized. That's kind of what the test is, right? So to me, when I look at this, yeah, both of these reading comps are on roughly the same level of difficulty. That's why we scale them similarly. All of these logical reasonings are on roughly the same level of difficulty. This is what I would expect for them to do, given the essentially wealth of content they have to choose from. What would be a little stranger to me is if they had one really hard reading comp and one really easy one, something that loosened the scale a lot and then something that tightened it up. One really brutal logical reasoning and then one that ranks among the easiest we've seen. That would be strange when they have the opportunity to keep things far more homogenous. So
it also reduces, kind of like complaints after the test.
Precisely.
That RC was hard. Yeah, mine was hard too. Everybody got hard RC. That LR didn't feel so bad. Mine too. Now, that's not always the case. LR does move around. I'm just using an example here. And in this case, it applies to what we just talked about. But this keeps conversation post-test rather uniform, which tends to create less upset.
Yeah. And again, they have the ability to do that when they're not creating new content. Again, internationals with the reuse of old stuff, and they've got clearly years and years and years to pull from, dozens of tests that they can pull from. They have the ability to do this in a much more standardized, consistent way. It's what we see here. I like that they do this. I just wish they hadn't done so. I try to keep these things PG. I wish they hadn't done so much of it.
That was quite a bit. And the bad news is we're about to see it even a little bit more now with the domestic test. It's going to be tough on you to go through all these sections, but I know that you're up to the task.
All
but
the
first,
podcast not to pour a drink.
But that's why I figured you got water so you can keep your throat ready to go, talk through it. I can just sit back, drink this amaretto sour, and then just hit these matrices and be done with it.
No, I gave up water years ago. Dry as a bone. But let's get into the domestic stuff. The good news with the domestic is now we can actually explore the crystal ball stuff a little more closely and give ourselves a grade, a self-assessment. We've already talked a little bit and alluded to quite literally with the song choice itself. This was a very interesting test. and we're about to explore more specifically why. Let's start with how the crystal ball did, and then let's talk about what LSAC did in, I think, fairly direct and obvious response to it. This test was a mix of brand new content, which is never what we're attempting to predict in the crystal ball. Quite frankly, it cannot be done. If we've never seen it before, if no one's ever seen it before, there's no hope of saying what it is that they're just going to randomly create for the first time ever. Instead, as we always talk about in the crystal balls themselves, what we're trying to do is predict typically first reuses, something that we have seen a couple years ago that we think is due for a reappearance, a first, typically, reappearance. And we do this in two ways. We tend to isolate individual sections of LR or RC that are just sitting there conspicuously untapped and ripe for picking, and whole tests at times if there's multiple sections on them that we think could reappear. That's what we're trying to predict. With this test here in April, domestically, we had a mix. There were sections in both RC and logical reasoning that were brand new. There were sections that were clearly reuses of the kind of content that our crystal ball attempts to predict. In the case of those reuses, everything, I'll say it again, every single piece of content that was a reuse in April was predicted in the crystal ball. I'll go further. It wasn't just predicted in the crystal ball, it was the exact section of content that we predicted in the crystal ball. In the case of reading comprehension, the section that was reused, we predicted all 4 topics. We listed the section itself. We listed all 4 of the passage topics explicitly. In fact, I think each one was the very first topic in its categorical section on the crystal ball page where I give those topics.
This was our number one test that we...
Yep. It was our number one test section, even. So it wasn't just catch-all test, it was section itself, which I'll tell you the section in a second. For logical reasoning, ditto. We don't list topics of LR questions because there'd just be dozens. But we listed this exact section, and it was the only section reuse for the entire week in April. So in terms of prediction there, we could not have been more accurate. The problem was, there was also a lot of new stuff that got thrown into the mix. That leads to a bunch of confusion, but it also, I think, kind of waters down for the uninitiated or the unaware what feels like the accuracy of the crystal ball. We were as accurate as we could have possibly been, because again, when you remove the new stuff, all that's left, the reuses, we got right to the letter.
Yeah, for what we were trying to predict, we predicted exactly.
Yeah, for what's possible to predict, we predicted exactly.
What was possible for us to predict, we predicted exactly. However, as we say in the crystal ball, we're not trying to predict everything. And so there are a number of people out there like, oh, I didn't have any of it. I'm like, yes, that does happen. We know that. That's actually built into it. We're not trying to predict everything. We're trying to predict what is we're capable of predicting, what really no one else is capable of predicting except us. So sometimes people are like, well, I got it. And they're all happy. And then other people are, darn, I didn't get any of it. And I'm like, yes, I understand that. I wish it wasn't the case, but there is no possible way to control for that. There's no way to cure it other than breaking into Newtown, Pennsylvania, going to the LSAC offices, breaking in and stealing whatever their plan is. And obviously, we don't have the time for that. I think we have the know-how, but not the time.
The perfect crime. It does exist.
There's that movie where they do that to the SAT. It's called like The Perfect Score or something.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. I couldn't say anything more about it.
Yeah, this movie's like 20 years old, but they break into, they go to ETS and break into it in I think it's Princeton, New Jersey.
Well, if I ever want to change of careers, there you go. There's always a fallback plan. Yeah, so as Dave is putting it, if you didn't see any content that we predicted, it's because you got something brand new that has never appeared before. If you got something reused, we did predict it. And again, you could have seen it coming if you had paid attention to the crystal ball, because we told you in advance that that was coming. So there you go. Those were your 2 possible paths for the past week here. Let's start with reading comprehension, and we'll start with the content that was real and that we did predict. This was from the November 2022 reading comprehension section. These were the topics. This was a section we predicted. And if you're listening and just went through all of that slog through the international stuff, you may be thinking, well, hang on. They just said that some of the international reading comp was also from November of 2022. That is correct. These tests ever since 2020 have contained multiple scored sections. The November 2022 reading comp used internationally was content that had been used multiple times before. In fact, it first appeared, as I said, in February of 2021. It also appeared in September of 2024. That was not stuff we expected to appear here domestically, and it didn't. The fact that it cropped up overseas was just kind of a fluke. What we did expect to appear here domestically was also from that test, but it contained these topics. It was a different scored section from November of 2022. These were the 4 passages that we predicted, and we listed all 4 of these topics exactly in the crystal ball. They were West African rice farming and cultivation and its impact in South Carolina. Not only did we predict this passage topic, I included a passage on this topic that's from a release test that you could go and practice. Specifically, it's from PT 110, the experimental section on that test, reading comp, passage number 4. It's about African rice farming in the 1700s, I believe, in South Carolina. So there you go. People actually had a chance to practice this topic itself on an LSAT. There was a passage in this section last week on Simon Rodia's building of Watts Towers here in, I say here, for me, here in Los Angeles. The nature, the cathedral-like nature of these towers. Topic that we predicted. A lot of people were messaging me afterwards like, I looked this up. I know exactly what those look like, what that's about. As soon as I saw it.
Cool.
Yeah. As soon as I saw it, I knew exactly what this passage was, and I knew this section was real. Pretty neat. There was a passage in there about civil lawsuits and settlements of those lawsuits. And the comparative passage in this section was about parallel discoveries in science and math and comparing the nature, essentially, of 2 different pairs of people. One, I think passage A was about Newton and Leibniz, and Darwin and Einstein was passage B. It was essentially comparing lone scientists, lone wolves, they called them, versus now that you need really groups and collaboration of people. Darwin, Einstein, Newton, Leibniz being lone wolves, now you get people kind of collaborating. There was a passage in the crystal ball on Darwin specifically. PT 101, passage number 1. So again, if you're unfamiliar with some of these names, which is a shame, but there was even a passage on at least one of the figures in that. So there you go.
Let me add a comment there. It's not that when we put those passages in there that we're saying it's going to be the same passage.
No, of course.
What we're saying is, here is an example of how LSAC is going to write about this topic. If you're going to talk about, West African rice farming, it'd be really nice to see something similar that LSAC has done previously on it. Same thing with, say, Darwin, to see how they treat it, because it's very likely that that passage was written by the same exact person who wrote this passage on the same topic. And so you get a sense of where they go with it, their style of writing, even some of the nuances in the questions. It at least kind of softens the ground. Yeah, you still have to read the passage and all the information that you need to answer the questions is in that passage, but you get a little bit of a faster uptake, a faster start, and perhaps, and actually not even perhaps, for those who have done this, they feel a lot better. I've heard that comment at least 1,000 times at this point.
Yeah,
I felt better about it. And the huge surge of adrenaline when you're like, I have recently read something on this and here it is. It feels as if, you just won the lottery.
Yeah, it's a very cool feeling. So there you go. We did something similar when I was expecting a passage about the Mali gold rush. I forget, it was maybe January or November. It's a few tests back, but there's a couple of passages out there on release tests. Do you remember when it was? You probably do.
First off, it's Mali as in M-A-L-I, the country.
Okay.
Just making sure everybody knows that.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the day they start to include some party drugs in the topicality.
Somebody out there has watched Euphoria and is now going to be like, I'm going to write a passage about this in about 10 years.
It wouldn't surprise me, man. We've had the Golden Girls, we've had the Twilight movie series or books, maybe.
If we ever see anything on Euphoria, I quit.
There's there's been multiple passages now on Outcast, the group, the rap group. So, it could happen. But yeah, in this case, Mali, the African country. But there was a passage we expected to come up on the gold rush nature of that. We'd seen it before and we knew it was coming. There's a released passage related to it, probably written by the same expert. And I gave that to people to prepare. And sure enough, the very next test, as we predicted, it came up. And I got message after message about, like, I did the one you told me to do. It prepared me a lot. I also did some research. That prepared me a lot. You saved the day. It's nice to hear, but it's even nicer, I think, to know that we can predict things to this extent. And there is this, correlation, correspondence. It's great. But now, Dave, here's where things got weird. If we're ready
I knew
for
this
it.
Transition was coming.
Yeah.
Here's where things did get weird.
Right. I've lived in our comfort zone long enough. I think we have to take a step out of it. Because that was not the only reading comp, unfortunately, that we saw last week. The other thing that happened with reading comprehension, and really the source of the song that Dave chose for us, and why our days were much longer than we had expected them to be, is that LSAT did the thing that we had long expected them to and long hoped they wouldn't, which is they kept two sections of reading comprehension, both of which, from what we could tell, were new, paired more or less the entire time, from what we could tell. Two sections of reading comprehension that we knew one of them was real and one of them was experimental, but they never split them up, or at least not in any way that was clear-cut and reliable for multiple people, such that we could tell, okay, we know this one is now real because it existed solo, which would make it real for everybody. We know this one is experimental because, again, we saw it used in different ways. When that happens, there is no obvious or concrete way to determine between two new sets of things that never get separated. There is no concrete way to determine for sure which of them is real, scored, versus which of them is experimental, unscored. And thus, we are in a bit of a pickle. Fair?
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that either.
Crap, I was really hoping you were like, no, here I come to save the day.
There's a little bit more to it. You and I have a feeling in one way here as opposed to other based upon some reports. But I think sometimes people think, oh, if I hear from one person, that just proves something to us. It doesn't. It takes multiple people. It's not just a preponderance of evidence. We want to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt when we're looking at this. We have multiple reports that from people who I think were accommodated test takers who had one of these sections. That's still not enough for us to prove that one of them is for sure. I'd rather be more sure. That said, John, why don't we go through the two sections, because everybody who had the two will know what they are, and then we can kind of, talk a little bit more about which direction it might rotate
here. People who
here.
had these two are already, they know what we're talking about. I'm sure they're already a little crestfallen of like, oh, they didn't crack it. There's a scored logical reasoning question about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony. And this reminds me a little bit of the nature of that, which is one or two reports among literally thousands and thousands of people. That's an awful lot of uncertainty left to
it's not enough.
Yeah, to base anything conclusive on here. So while I think we have our suspicions based on that, and we'll share them, it's not enough for me to say that I'm certain, or you, I think. Here's the section that, based on those scant reports, would be real if they are to be believed. But again, take this with a boulder of salt. 27 questions. Here's one of the two that we saw, and the one that a few people did report seeing alone, accommodated people seeing alone. So if they're right, this would be the scored section. It had passage topics on biopiracy, so challenges to patents, misappropriated old Indian medical, our medicinal traditions, dealing with like nutmeg and turmeric. There's a passage in there about highbrow or high literature and criticizing it, drawing enthusiasm away, I think, from reading and literature. And here's where you need to be careful. This is the first instance where our crystal ball list of topics got misread or misinterpreted to be a prediction match. We had in our crystal ball list a topic that we expect at some point soon will come up, and it specifically said this, in quotes, sentimentality in highbrow/lowbrow literature. People saw highbrow literature, people saw this passage and said it's the same. It is not. This passage had nothing to do with sentimentality, which means if you weren't reading closely, you wouldn't catch that distinction. This was not that passage that we were predicting. I know that in part because I know the other three passages that we also predicted that go with it. I know the section. This was not a match to that section. Here's where it gets even worse. Another passage in this section, the comparative passage, had to do with gene plasticity and Darwin, evolutionary theory. This was a verbatim match for a passage that we predicted in our crystal ball. It literally says gene plasticity and Darwin. A lot of people saw this and bells went off, light bulbs immediately, Fireworks. There it is. That's a match. And it is a match. But it was the only match in this section, which means the section itself didn't match our predictions. When we predict a section, we're going to give you 3 or 4 of the topics, just like we did with the last section I just talked about. West African rice, in there. Simon Rodia's Watts Towers, in there. Civil lawsuits and settlements, in there. Parallel discoveries and lone wolves in science and math. Darwin, Einstein, Newton, Leibniz, in there. All 4 of those were listed, which means you can trust that's the section itself. It's real, it's predicted, it's scored. If you only get one match like gene plasticity and Darwin, that was the only match in this section, it's not what we're predicting. And
interestingly enough, it is very likely that these passages were written by the originators of those.
Yep.
So if you had looked this up, gene plasticity and the highbrow literature and so forth, you still get benefited.
Yeah.
Even when it's not a perfect match like that. And John, I think sometimes maybe we get a little too into the weeds because you and I are having a conversation about our own standards, which are extremely high and very specific and detailed. No one else has that discussion, and they're mostly not caring. They're like, hey, I looked up gene plasticity. It helped me a little bit. That's all I cared about. But your point is that was not the arbiter of whether or not this was a real section.
Right.
Even if we would tend to think this is the more likely real one of the two, it's not because of this. It's because of something else.
Precisely right. Yeah. So I think you make a really good point that I'll circle back to as I get the 4th passage explained here or described here. But what I want people to understand is that single hit or single match was a false flag of sorts. And I think very deliberate on LSAC's part. We know they listen to these crystal balls. We know it irks them a little bit. Not only how accurate.
We know they attend.
Well, yeah, they do more than listen. They show up and lurk.
I know this for a fact.
Yeah.
Because I've gotten calls the next morning. We have a question and a complaint. I'm like, yes, I understand.
Yeah. So, yeah, they're very well aware of what we say and these things, what we say and do. So I think this was quite deliberate, quite intentional to try to fool people. I think to your point, Dave, that attempted subterfuge or call it what you want, misdirection, worked against them in a way, because if this was the scored section, or hell, even if it wasn't, ultimately we were able to give people some insights into a passage topic. And again, there was a passage recommended on Darwin too, so it's kind of a double whammy. They could look it up and then go do one on Darwin. If this was real or not, people then just got a passage based on our recommendation that they should have been more familiar with, that they should have felt more comfortable with. So LSAC's little gamemanship here, I think, probably helped people more than it did anything to hurt us or throw people off the scent.
Yeah, the confusion that they may have caused, I think, was limited to, didn't matter.
Yep.
It didn't cause real confusion. And in fact, the benefit was probably far greater than any confusion it caused.
Right. Well, the point I'm making is
debatable.
that single match to a predicted topic was not enough to guarantee that this was a real section. We need more than just one hit, one match for that to be the case. In fact, a single match alone is enough to tell you that it's probably not a match of a section at all. Just be happy that the topic itself is something you know.
It's got to be...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's got to be, as you said with highbrow, it's got to be as close to exact as possible, and that one wasn't.
Yeah.
All right, I'll let you go on.
No, this is why we are more specific, more detailed than just saying something like, rice farming. It's West African rice farming and cultivation in South Carolina. If it was just rice or farming, then it wouldn't be enough. This is why we talk more about like Simon Watts building of Watts Towers in LA and not just like, high-rise architecture.
Yeah, and if you're wondering why we're belaboring this point, it's because I think what we do in the crystal ball is so widely misunderstood. I don't think most people really understand it, especially in our competitor sphere. They don't want to believe it's possible. It just sounds ridiculous on the face of it. And as I've said before, yeah, if you would have told me this 20 years ago, I'd be like, forget about it. That's a lie.
Yeah.
I would not have believed this was possible 20 years ago. But I also wouldn't believe that LSAC would fall into an obvious and identifiable pattern that we've now proved 34 out of the last 36 LSATs that we can predict. So I get the skepticism, but at the same time, I think a lot of it's born about misunderstanding what it is we're attempting to do here, and in fact, what we are doing here because we achieve it so often.
Yeah, I think we can actually update that number now because I think this makes 35 to 37. So the hits keep coming. I think
I'm always one step behind here. I didn't realize it was that. I can
promise you that's not true, but.
Damn, I like that.
Yeah. And to be fair, before they started introducing multiple tests a year like they're doing here and running concurrent tests over the same administration. We couldn't have done this. It didn't exist when they were just running for a year and it was a single event, one day, one test, everybody, because they didn't reuse things like this. So
no, and that's the key thing. They're reusing so many tests.
Right.
They have so many exams that they have to give to make really cheating go away, that they're opening themselves up to this problem. We understand why it is. We understand. I think they understand why they do it, and they're like, we're more worried about cheating than we are about this. I think that's kind of like the devil's bargain they make.
Exactly. Yeah. Good way to put it. Well said. So before 2020, this wasn't even a thing. So
didn't happen.
Yeah. The fourth passage in this section, again, biopiracy with Indian medicine, highbrow literature criticism, gene plasticity in Darwin. And then finally, the fourth passage, although perhaps not in this order, nature and the psychology of curiosity, specifically in relation to drive, as it was put. That's a new section. Again, suspect it was the real one of the two that were paired, but we can't be certain. Let's talk about the one that it was paired with. Also 27 questions, also brand new, so nothing to predict in this. These were the four passages in it. There was a passage about take it or leave it. I heard some people call it give and take contracts. A passage about Jane Jacobs, her theory about first cities, that cities developed before agriculture, kind of a controversial theory as it turns out. It's a passage on a topic you and I have seen a bunch about Vermeer and art forgeries, Van Meegeren, famous forger, and the appraisal and valuation. Should forgeries and imitation art be given the same kind of appraisal and value as the real thing, the authentic thing? That was the comparative passage, tricky one apparently. And then Ernest Everett Just's theory, E.E. Just's theory of cell differentiation, had to do with cytoplasm rather than just the nucleus playing the primary role in cell development and differentiation. So tricky science one there for people as well. It was a tough section. In fact, both of those sections people reported to be pretty tough. Some mixed reports. I heard some people say the first that we talked about, biopiracy and genes, being harder. Other people had a very different take, said the Vermeer art forgery section was harder, but neither, clearly, a walk in the park.
All right, so that is all the RC there.
Yeah. Those were the only three sections of RC that we saw domestically, and like I said, sometimes overseas as well. So that's the end of RC discussion. There was obviously a lot of LR floating around domestically too. Let's move into that. I think we've got a pretty good group on this. It's possible, as you've mentioned before, though, that there is an LR section still floating around. We're also not going to cover every single question that we know about. So you may have had some questions that won't get mentioned here. Hopefully you can identify at least a few of these and know then that that section should be real for you. Let's go through it. The first I'm going to start with is a section that is a reuse and is a section that we predicted as the most or one of the most likely LR sections to come up. This is straight out of the crystal ball, 26 questions, and it came from August of 2021. So one of the LRs that we said was very likely to come up. Here are some of the question topics from it. I'll give you 7 or 8 of them. There was one early question. I think it might have been like question 2 or 3. Tamarin monkeys learning and understanding basic language prefixes and suffixes. There was one about artists mixing their own gray paint versus buying it directly. I think it was cheaper. There was one about farmers deciding how to solve a nitrate runoff issue on their farms. A plane crash. This feels topical, sadly, scarily. Due to inspection by inexperienced versus experienced technicians. I think they'd gone to the site of a crash and figured out that inexperienced people were the cause. People shouldn't be taxed for free lunches provided by their jobs or their employers. This question there. Maybe the most talked about question in this section had to do with a meteorite, blue-green algae, and the traces that it left, and people arguing whether that was evidence or not for extraterrestrial life. There was a question in there about a clinic, I think a nurse at the vet clinic, injecting using antibiotics on endangered animal species and what it did to their immune systems. And then a question that also got a lot of conversations, a tricky one, I think, about perforated stamps. I'm sure that's ringing a bell for some people. How they were designed to make tearing them easier so that the stamps themselves wouldn't get ripped, wouldn't get damaged. You could tear them at the edges based on the perforations. Again, if even a few of those ring a bell, that section as a whole for you was real. And that was the predicted section. The rest of what we saw, logical reasoning, scored and unscored, was all brand new. 3 more scored sections that I'll run through. Here is a new section, so nothing we would have predicted. A tricky one. Let me go through some topics from it. So again, these were all real, should have been together for you. There was one about a researcher. I think the name P.J. Franklin was the name. Researcher having his assistants find information that just happens to coincide with what he thinks or his conclusion. That was a confirmation bias type of flaw. I think it was a parallel question. One of the answers, I believe, talked about rolling dice and looking for threes, and then threes come up more often. Classic kind of Vegas mistake. There was one about nonfiction writers being grouped into professional versus unprofessional groups or non-professional groups, and then writing more about their fields. A question a lot of people were talking about, a tricky question about the moon, Europa, a Jupiter moon, having craters on the surface that were occasionally wiped clean based on tidal gravitation. A question about a volcano, I believe it was a mountain called Pavlov, erupting in the autumn 12 out of the last 16 times, and then using that, predicting that it would erupt in autumn again. Ripe tomatoes with dark green spots and them tasting better. A topic that, again, we talk about experts here. Stickleback fish. I love them some stickleback fish. Somewhere there's a stickleback expert, and he has written a boatload of questions for them that they keep pulling from. In this case, it was stickleback fish following a healthy leader. 2 different groups, and they kind of monitored behavior to see who they would follow. Following them home, I think. And then a question on the idea of no pain, no gain, and that being a bit of a myth. Specifically to do with swimming. Swimming is better in this case compared to walking and jogging because you don't risk injury to your joints. Again, if a handful of those sound familiar, if you can place those to a section, that was a real section. Those were all scored. Keep going. Another real logical reasoning section, another new one. Again, we had not seen these come up before that I could find anyway. I believe the first question in this section, one that I'd like to see, kind of made me laugh, mostly because I have 2 little nieces and this sounded about right, was a baby spilling juice on a laptop or computer. And then the question was, who pays for the damages? This happened while a babysitter was there. Is the babysitter to blame, or should the parents have to pay for this computer and the damages? There's a question in there a lot of people were talking about, a tricky one, about oak trees, and they shed a lot of acorns during what was called mast years. I believe this question had something to do with moths as well, maybe posing some sort of a threat. A question that I think may have had a little bit of a games feel to it, although there's another one in this section that definitely did that I'll get to. In this case, it was a question about people in Rockdale, although a lot of people called it Rockville or Rocktown. I'm pretty sure Rockdale is what it was. And it was one of these ideas like a numbers and percentages thing, causality involved. With them moving out of town or staying home, adventurous people are more likely to move, so who's left in Rockdale if adventurous people tend to leave? Bicycles and bike lanes and shadeless bike lanes and trees. The most games heavy style question in this, as we've been predicting, if you were at the Crystal Ball, we gave you 10 of these to practice with. In this case, it was about sales reps visiting different cities for their jobs, towns with sales reps. Question about juvenile curfews, and when these get implemented, the crime rate changes. In this case, it drops. No surprise. Youths. And then violation of copyright with CD-ROM, so another copyright question, Dave. In this case, it's only immoral, so Jack Dorsey would like it, if it harms people. So you can violate copyright all you like. If nobody's harmed, what's the big deal?
Only if people are harmed.
Only if people are harmed, right. Nobody gets harmed, steal away. And then finally, another question, kind of a latecomer from what I could see. I didn't see anybody talking about this much until late Saturday. It's not to say it didn't appear sooner, but the conversation kicked into gear, kind of late, 11th hour conversation. Real from what I could tell, also I think the smallest administered of the sections from what I could see. Also new, this had some topics on fraternal and identical twins and their favorite color. Question about cybersecurity, like a cybersecurity firm, and protection, computer security, perhaps how people held their mobile phones. Fence and ecology in Australia. Another one about kids, children, babies under 6 months, and their vocabulary. This may have had to do with them sitting in parents' laps and following their parents' eyes. I think they had to identify an apple by name, kind of following it around a computer screen. There was a question in this section as well, apparently, about a highly acclaimed film festival. So again, if you can match a few of those topics, those were real as well. And again, we know all of these are real, not because they're reuses and we've seen them before, but because we were getting these reports from people with only 2 logical reasoning sections, paired with those annoying 2 reading comp sections that I talked about before. Gene plasticity in the one, Vermeer and art forgeries in the other.
Yeah, and as usual, it always gets mixed together, and it's really easy after the test to think, wait, were those different sections? This is why we always recommend take notes immediately after your exam ends so that you can separate all of this out. In this case, especially because the LR will move around a little bit in terms of its scoring and its assignment to the scale, which I'll get to in just a minute.
Okay.
John, some of these questions, it's interesting when I hear about them from students. I'm like, people shouldn't be taxed for free lunches provided by their employers. I mean, if you work at Google or Apple and they have like a free cafeteria, you get taxed on that? I didn't know that.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, although knowing these companies, I'm sure there is probably something they take out of your check before it's delivered.
Wow. That's the worst. It's supposed to be a job perk. And also, if the baby spilled the juice on the computer, all right, it's the parents who pay.
Yeah, I would think so.
Why is this a debate? The babysitter's not responsible. You have a baby is going to act like a baby, and it's going to do stuff like that.
It is funny how some of these questions would elicit different responses from people in different situations. Like, I didn't think twice about the baby one, but I'm sure there's people out there who babysit that are like, obviously the parents should have to pay. Well, and I'm sure there's some parents out there who are like, well, what's the babysitter doing? Why wasn't
their job?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that question about CD-ROMs, and I was like, do people today know what CD-ROMs are? That came and went relatively quickly from a historical standpoint. I'm like, why are we talking about CD-ROMs on the LSAT?
Yeah,
anyway.
You can sometimes see, like, obviously they're not on the test anymore, but every once in a while I'd come across a student would bring a game, like a logic game in, and there'd be something about someone repairs radios and VCRs, and I'd be like, where'd you find this antique? Like, this has got to be from the 90s.
Well, I only make a few humorous comments about those questions because I'm about to actually run through it here. You just did the heavy lifting.
Thanks, bud.
On identifying all the sections there. So let's get into the matrix. And once again, I ask that people not summarize this online. Just send people to this timestamp in the podcast if somebody asks, simply because it's tough. There's some nuance in here. And also, as you can see from our discussion of RC up above, we actually debated it a little bit in terms of like what's real and what's not. So I'm going to allude to that, but the real discussion is up above. Remember, with the way we look at scoring, we start off with a baseline of you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. We're only focused on 170 because top level difficulty is much easier for us to see. When we're uncertain, meaning we're not looking at these sections directly, we will be more conservative than not because that usually makes for happier outcomes on score release day. As I go through this, listen for the sections that you had and then adjust that 7s. Usually it would either be that it stays the same and it'd still miss 7 questions to 170. If a section was notably harder, we'll say that will loosen the scale and move it to 8. Sometimes we talk about half points. When we get to the one where we've identified that, I'll mention that as well. So everybody starts at -7, meaning you can miss 7 questions for a 170. Let's start off with that first RC passage, the one that we predicted from November 2022. It's got the rice farming, Watts Towers, the civil lawsuits, and scientific discoveries. We've seen this multiple times before, and our take on this is this does not move the scale. So everybody who had that, you stay at 7 questions missed. Now we've got that watch the world burn pair that I've referenced here, and Jon and I have talked about. That's why I chose the old Ronnie Radke song on watching the world burn, because this was LSAC's attempt to drive everybody nuts. Interestingly enough, our take on both sections is that they have an identical effect, that both of them are -1. So no matter which one was real, if you had this pairing, your scale is going to move from 7 to 8. We have talked about having reports that suggest that the first of those 2 passages, the one about biopiracy, the high literature, gene plasticity, and curiosity, may well in fact be the scored section. It doesn't matter though, that is going to loosen your scale by 1. The other section on contracts, first cities, art forgeries, Vermeer, cell differentiation, that's also a -1. So from a scaling standpoint, if you had that pairing, it's going to move your scaling no matter which one is real. And yeah, if I had to place some money, I'd probably make a small bet on biopiracy as being the real one based on the reports. But as Jon and I both talked about before, we didn't feel like the evidence was overwhelming. And what we want is overwhelming evidence before we're going to claim something is real.
Yeah.
This doesn't happen often. It is very rare. And I think this was very intentional by LSAC to be like, let's cause problems.
Right. Yeah.
And they did.
Somebody asked me on Reddit, they're like, if you guys aren't sure, will you still act like you're sure? I was like, no, trust me, it'll be quite the opposite. Until we are very, very certain, we're going to hedge and throw caveats and disclaimers galore. So, yeah.
I'm interested in being right.
We don't play certain until we are absolutely certain.
Exactly. I mean, that would be stupid. I want to look good just to look good. No, I'm interested in being right. If I'm not certain about it, and you and I have said this before in podcasts and crystal balls, we will go ahead and talk about that. There's nothing wrong. We don't make the test. We're trying to analyze it post exam, sometimes there's going to be uncertainties. In fact, I'm astonished over the years there haven't been more uncertainties. To me, that says that LSAT does a bad job of kind of being, tricksters.
Yeah.
So I'll criticize them. But again, we've talked about that. If you're just tuning into this last part, go back earlier in the podcast and listen to our discussion of those two sections, because we do go into some greater detail about that discussion. So everybody is either 7 or 8 at this point. If you had the rice farming, you are 7. If you had the 2 pairs with biopiracy and the other one was about, the first cities, then you would be at -8. Now let's get into LR. It is a little bit trickier. There are more options here. Let's start with that first one from August 2021 about the gray paint, the nitrate runoff, which I assume, John, is probably pig farming, because don't they run off a huge amount of nitrates?
Yeah, that's my guess too.
Lunch taxes, perforated stamps. We've seen this one before. We feel like this is in the middle. And so if you had this section, it will not move your scale at all. So you'd either be at 7 or 8. Now let's go to the 3 new sections where things get, they're all different. So messy. Yeah. We'll start off with the first one about nonfiction writers, Europa craters, volcanic eruption, tomatoes, and the annoying stickleback fish. This section we think is harder than the other 2 that were new here. If you had this section, it would move your scale by 1.
Yeah.
So if you were at 7, you'd go to 8. If you were at 8, you'd go to 9. Mm-hmm. All right, next, the section about the baby spilling the juice and me saying that the parents are responsible, the oak trees and acorns, the Rockdale adventurous people, the bike lane, and the juvenile curfews. This is an interesting one because I feel like this is in the middle. At the very top, it is probably not hard enough to change the scale at 170, but as you move down to say 165 and 160, it would move the scale. If you listen to prior podcasts, we term this a 0.5.
Yeah.
So you have to figure out where you're scoring on the scale. If you're like a 150 score, this is going to move the scale for you. If you're a 170 score, it's probably not. I think it's a little bit debatable here as to whether it was a half or 1. In this case, we decided to make it a half because we go more conservative in terms of doing this. And then finally, the last of the LR sections, the twins' favorite colors, cybersecurity, Australia, fence ecology, baby name objects. We also think this is in the middle and does not move the scale, so that one would be 0. So you can see there's a number of combinations that are theoretically possible if you were to just randomly mix and match all of this. It doesn't happen that way, but that is ultimately the breakdown. And so start at 7, listen for the sections that you had, and then move or not move the scale as it depends. And then at the end, you'll get something like 8, 8.5, whatever it may be, that would be the number of questions that you can miss for 170. And obviously, we will all find out how people scored on Wednesday, April 30th, around 9 a.m. Eastern in the morning. It's been a little bit earlier, 8:50, 8:55 in recent tests. But John, nice job on recapping all that.
Oh, thanks.
I think it's the first time you ever did the full test section discussion. Then I just did all the matrix stuff. So
yeah, thanks. I hated it. So let's definitely not make this a tradition, or at the very least, let's not make me doing it entirely sober a tradition, because maybe that was the part I hated.
A tradition like no other, John.
I know. And congrats to Rory. I know he's not your favorite golfer, but as a former Augusta boy myself, it was nice to see him complete the career Grand Slam. If people don't know what I'm talking about, the Masters was just this past weekend, and that's the Masters slogan, a tradition, unlike any other.
And Augusta, Georgia is where you and I met.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The good old days. So we're both from Augusta. You and I both been to the Masters, although not together.
No, that's true. It's funny we never got a chance to go out there together. I've been to that course more times than I can count. I've played it 4 times.
Yeah, and I've played it 0 times. And that's justice because I'm a terrible golfer.
Yeah, I've played it 4 times, but not professionally. They have yet to invite me to the tournament to play.
Surprised they invited you back after the first time you played the Masters.
It's funny.
The course.
Yeah, no, they give everybody their own cart. It's there's just kegs. It's all you can drink, all you can play. They let you play the par 3 as many times as you want to go around it. It's a free for all when they let you out there. It's like an appreciation day kind of thing. I didn't get to go out there with members or anything. It's a one-off.
You're not playing with Bill Gates, is what you're telling me.
No, Bill won't return my calls. I don't know what's going on.
It's because you don't have his phone number.
And Melinda won't leave me alone, so it's a real split those two.
I don't know about that.
Oh, well, yeah, you do. It's false.
I did know that.
Yeah.
Any last comments, Jon?
I need a nap, but no. Other than that, I'm happy to be through this one. It was an interesting test. I know a lot of confusion, more confusion than I can recall seeing, I think, in recent years, frankly. So hopefully this helped to clear some of that up. I hate that we didn't have total confirmation on certain things. If any of what we just said is maybe still a little mysterious to people, if you didn't hear your section as we've repeated throughout this, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us now. Don't be shy. Even if it won't affect this podcast itself, it would still be good for our records and our general sense of well-being to hear from you. So
yeah,
don't be strangers at this point.
You can contact Jon or I on Reddit, and you can contact both of us on Twitter/X, and you can also send an email to LSAT at PowerScore and just title it to Jon and Dave, and they will send it on to us. And on that note, if you get a chance, subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave a rating or comment as well. There's another email address you can send questions or comments to, and that's lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. Regardless, we hope this has been helpful. Next week, we'll probably talk about the U.S. News Law School rankings that just came out and dissect those as we do every year. But in the meantime, we hope this test went well for you. Stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.